Welcome to Detoxicity. By men, about men, for everyone. This is a podcast that's attempting to remix the narrative around masculinity, and I thank you for listening and supporting. If you're new to the podcast, I hope you check out the archive, which contains over 150 episodes. I'm always happy when someone reaches out with a friendly word or constructive criticism, so never hesitate to hit me up either via IG at DetoxPodGuy or via email, detoxpod@gmail.com. You can also contact me if you're interested in being a guest on the show or if you know someone who might be a good guest for the show. There's also a Detoxicity Patreon. Patrons get episodes 1 week early, plus I will mail you a cool DetoxPod fridge magnet. Go to bit.ly/DetoxPodPlus to find out more. Oh, one more thing. Late last year, I completed my certification courses, and I am now a life and relationship coach. I'm taking clients. Go to mike-joseph.com and book a free consultation. Thanks for listening. I really do appreciate you. Okay, everybody. This episode is actually, at the point that I'm saying this, is probably one of the best conversations, most impactful, most touching and thoughtful conversations that I can recall having for this podcast. And I don't like to play favorites, but I think all of the episodes that I put out have some value. But for whatever reason, and maybe it's because of the conversation we have at the end, this one really hit me in the feels quite a bit. Jayson Greene is an author, he's a music critic, he's an editor, he is a dad, he is a husband, he is a sibling, he is a Brooklynite, he is many things. I initially got to know Jayson through my work in music journalism. He was a senior editor of Pitchfork. He wrote a book called Once More We Saw Stars, which is a memoir about the tragic passing of his 2-year-old daughter. We talk about music journalism, we talk about grief, we talk about the book a little bit, and I really didn't want to make that the focus of this episode because Jayson's done lots of stuff that you can find online where he talks about the book, and those conversations have already been had. But what we end up exploring even more is what masculinity means, which is, look, it's the overall premise of this show. And Jayson is extremely vulnerable and extremely thoughtful and extremely articulate about his experience, which is evolving. So much so that we decided pretty quickly that this was not going to be a one-shot deal. So there will be a part 2 at some point, maybe even a part 3. Who the hell knows? But I really, really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope that you enjoy and get something out of it too. So welcome to my friend Jayson Greene.
Okay, my name is Jayson Greene. I am a writer. I was a music journalist for a very long time. I still am occasionally, but these days I'm more of a writer of books. I wrote a memoir in 2019, and I just finished a novel.
Congratulations on finishing the novel. We were talking a little bit about that before we hit record, and that sounds like it was kind of an arduous process there.
I mean, it's funny for me to sort of try to take stock of how arduous the novel was, because I've tried to compare my own struggles to do this with what I know of other writers talking about their novels. And I found so many stories that were so much worse than my own, which made me feel both better and worse, like better in that, okay, it quote unquote only took me 6 years
Jesus
to do this instead of 9 or 12. But also, what the hell have I chosen to do with my life that it regularly takes people 9 years to feel any sense of accomplishment? What have I chosen? But yeah, one of my anecdotes that I held on to, especially as this process dragged out, was that Jenny Ofel, who is a hero writer of mine, she wrote this book called The Department of Speculation, which first of all, it's like the thickness of, I don't know, like a Moleskine. It is probably 150 pages.
Okay.
And if you open it up, it's mostly white space. It's like lines. It took her 9 years I get it because you have to write a lot and then chisel out probably to get the good stuff. And maybe it was actually harder to do that. But the story I heard was that she had it on her desktop for 9 years on a folder that was called Bad Novel. And I was like, all right, well, that novel won awards. I feel like if that's how she felt, then maybe I'm on some sort of track. But, it took way longer than I wanted it to. I had never written fiction. I feel like I can't stress that point quite enough now that I've undertaken this foolhardy journey. The last time I tried to write a made-up story in my life as a writer was when I was 13 in my 7th grade English class, and I was ripping off like a fantasy novel for my 7th grade English teacher. I lost the nerve, the will, the whatever you have to call it to write fictional stories from then, and I didn't write them even in college. I just kind of took a turn away from this whole world, and so after the memoir came out, I wasn't handed a blank check by any stretch of anyone's imagination, but I was handed a runway of time in my life when I'd accomplished something that was huge to me. I'd never imagined I would get to that point, having written a book. I mean, the circumstances, which we can talk about, weren't, but there I was nonetheless. I had a big book coming out. I had a little bit of cover because the way the book advance was paid out, I had a year where I didn't have to think too hard about scrambling to make money. And I was like, okay, this is a weird time in my life. I've kind of left behind my previous career track of music journalist rather abruptly and had consumed my every waking moment for the previous 10 years. And I was facing a sort of what could I do next? And I was like, well, maybe this is where I look back at my life and think about what are some things that I wish I had done? What are some things I left behind in my life that I've never really forgotten? And when I was a little kid, what I wanted to be was a writer. An author was the word I used. It's funny that I settled on that word because the distinction there is very important. An author is someone who's written a finished book, right? A writer is just someone who sits down and writes, but an author is like, well, here's my book. And clearly in my head, that was what I wanted. And so I was like, right. So if I'm an author, or if I want to be some vision of that, what's the thing that I lost the nerve to do? And I was like, all right, it's time for me to write a novel. And it's so funny because that's like the classic white man's folly of every late 30-something, early 40-something white male who's entering into the stretch of their lives and they don't know what to do with themselves anymore. They're like, I'm going to write that novel. And it's always a story of, oh, well, I remember that 6 months when dad disappeared into the shed and tried to become a novelist and then came out and was like, fuck it, I'm going back to work as an insurance salesman. All I had on my head was those sort of stories echoing in my consciousness. And I knew intellectually that I was not that dad because I had a book coming out on Knopf, like the world's biggest publisher. It had my name on it. I knew that I was, quote unquote, a real author. But it doesn't matter because when you're writing and you're just at your computer, you feel as much of a fraud as the person who's never published. It doesn't really ever go away. And it's funny, I'm reading this novel right now. It's really good. It's called A Meaningful Life. It's kind of a 1970s classic of a certain kind of genre. It's kind of fallen out of favor now, but where it's the middle-class white man just realizes his life sucks, even though his life is perfect in most regards. He's privileged, but he's like, I don't want to say American Beauty because that's a skeevy, gross example, but that's a movie people know where it's like middle-class dad realizes there's something missing in his life, and it's a comedy, and what is he doing? He's fucking struggling through his life and his loveless marriage trying to write a terrible novel, and I'm like, if I had read this book even 6 months earlier, it would have needed a trigger warning. I would have had to put it down because it would have sent me into paroxysms. I would have not been able to finish it. And now I'm like, ha, 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 funny. But the existential terror was very real. It lasted for 6 years. When you're catching me on the other end of it, 24 hours after hearing from my editor, it's done, it's good.
So you're not even in full I'm relieved mode yet.
Not quite, no. And I also, that I'm relieved mode is kind of interesting and messy with the book because even once you've gotten it to this point in the journey where it's going to copy editing, it still feels pretty messy to me because it's going to come back like she had 3 small questions. This character should probably do more. This character should probably do more. So why don't you write that? And somehow it's still a rush at the very last minute despite having spent 6 years of my life on it. So I'm looking at it and I'm like, is this cooked? I'm serving this food. It's about to go out. Am I about to poison an entire dining room full of people with my undercooked prose? So no, it's hard to feel a clean break sense of relief. It comes in waves. Like I walked around and I was like, I have a little more room in my head today. Oh, that's coming from me not being terrified that this hasn't been sent. But it isn't like, oh, the clouds have parted. Like also writing, particularly something like this where you're the only driver, there's no deadline. I mean, there's sort of a deadline, but unlike journalism where it's like your editor is snapping their fingers over your shoulder, there's a reason for what you're writing to exist outside of you, which is a huge one with journalism, right? Like if my name isn't on this, someone else's name will be, this story will exist. So I'm just stepping up to the plate. I'm being the line cook. I always love the kitchen metaphor for writing because I feel like, especially with editors, it just sort of feels like that behind the scenes. I got to just do this job. I mean, it is work for hire. But when you're a novelist, it's sort of like No one asked you to bake this, and you've told people you're making it. People keep checking in on it, and you're like, no, another 2 years, and it's not something anyone asked for, right? And if it didn't show up, the world wouldn't miss it. And there's no reason for it to exist other than you have this bug up your ass that you should try to write it. And that is a much mushier and harder ascent because there's no firm ground outside of you to reassure you that what you're doing is not pure folly, pure vanity, pure silliness, right? Which is the eternal, like, why am I doing this? You could go to any writer's workshop in the world. This is what writers talk about when they're together. This is their therapy. They're like, why am I fucking doing this? What's wrong with me? It is funny how much it feels like pathology for anyone who like spends their life doing it.
Yeah, it's interesting hearing what this process is like, because having been a journalist and fancied myself a writer and all this stuff, and the idea of sitting down and working on something for years on end, just like my attention span so short that I've started to write stuff and been like, fuck it. But also understanding the difference between journalism, that whole work for hire process, and sitting actually writing a book that no one has any background on. No one knows this is happening. So it's like writing about something where the expectation is that somebody's going to read this in 2 or 3 days, and it's almost like you're reacting to something that's happening in the world.
Sure, there's juice flowing out there in the world. Yeah. There's energy you're responding to.
Yeah, absolutely. So were you always like, I want to write?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it was one of those very pure childhood sort of things where I would tell my mom to write stories down for me. I have vivid enough recall of those really formative early years where it's like, I don't remember a lot, but I do remember sitting down at my mom's kitchen table before I could write and be like, write this down for me. And then when I was in first or second grade and I started reading, it's sort of compulsion, you have those green rectangular worksheets you practice your letters on. And I had just read Judy Blume's Tales of a Fourth Grade Nothing, which is a classic Pain Little Brother book. I didn't have a younger brother, but I was so obsessed with that book and I loved it so much. I just instantly and compulsively as a kid started writing my own version with the little brother, and I'm writing as the older brother, and I wrote multiple chapters, and there's a picture of me at my desk like this little kid, and he's got all these green papers strewn across. I mean, I'm in full Beethoven mode writing my Judy Blume knockoff. So it was always very dialed in for me. All my memories of school from that very fuzzy early age are of excitement because every day there was a writing prompt. And one day a week, it was like, you can write about whatever you want. And I can still tap into the feeling I had as a 7-year-old or 6-year-old of, this is amazing. And that being really important to me. Yeah. And it was always important forever. I mean, I mentioned there was a little moment that happened when I published the memoir and my mom was digging through in the process of excavating her basement. They were moving out of the house that they'd lived in for a long time. And when you do that, you find all these things, these pieces of your past that have been sitting in a box for decades. And she sent me a picture on her phone of some sort of essay I'd been asked to write in 4th grade, which I would have been 10, I think. And it was all about me. And I wrote a 2-page essay, and what do you want to be was the last question you had to answer. And I was like, I want to be a father and an author, which was, to me, I did not know as a 10-year-old that I harbored a desire to be a father. That was news to me. But it was one of those things where she's like, hey, look at this. This has always been something that you've thought about. Yeah, and then I could keep going. But basically, at some point in my adolescence, music became all important. I think a lot of it has to do with that music you can share with your friends, and writing is just something you do all alone. Like, you can't sit together with your friends and write, and it wasn't something other kids even did anyway. And so my life became about music. You can also insulate yourself from the world in a different sense with music. You can put up more of a buffer between yourself and reality, which as you get a little older, reality becomes harsher. It becomes more difficult and confusing to navigate.
Yeah.
And music really serves a really powerful role, if it speaks to you, of blocking that out and tuning into this thing that is happening in your ears. And so my whole life was redirected slightly away from just writing for the writing's sake to music and what I thought about music. And as I was an adolescent and struggling through all the normal adolescent stuff and bullying and blah, 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 I distinctly recall that what I would do to escape when I got home from school and whatever had happened to me that day is I would just like sit and read issues of Rolling Stone and Spin from cover to cover. And it was once a month and I didn't always get to the store. So I'd have maybe the same issue and I would just read the same issue for weeks on end until the staples fell out and the pages fell apart. and essentially committed these reviews written by whoever was on staff at the time of whatever record came out, happened to come out that month, to memory without really trying to, right? It's almost an embarrassment to me as an adult to think back on how vividly I can recall lines from like the 1997 issue of Spin with whoever was on the cover, because this is what I did with my time. And I wasn't studying, it was just a sort of ritual. And so that diverted a lot of my interest, energy, and attention away from books and stories to music and writing about music. And that defined the next 20 years of my life, essentially.
How does one become a pre-internet, right? Like
pre-internet, right?
Or not necessarily pre-internet, but we're sort of in a post-gatekeeping era of journalism, right? Where previously, and I think when you were coming up, there was a barrier to entry to becoming a journalist. How do you jump over that barrier? What was the thing that turned you from some guy writing about music to an actual music journalist?
It's so funny to think about music journalism, because 99% of what is referred to as music journalism, and this is pedantic, is not technically journalism in any real sense of that word. I'm not saying that to be negative. It's just like journalism is a trade, it's a craft, it has a guild. It has a certain gravitas, and so people like to say that. But what most people are who write music journalism are music critics, right? And critic is just not a word people love to embrace, even those who are. Like, that was a person at a newspaper, and they still got a lot of crap. You might be a crank and an annoying figure, but you were the famous one. And so there was at least a sort of like, oh my God, you're the local town critic, or whatever it was. It's so funny to think about that as being a title now. But in the late 80s, early 90s, you had your critic of your local newspaper or whatever. And then Roger Ebert and Gene Siskel sort of made it into a bit of a pop cultural figure. But most people who write music journalism are just critics by another name. So when you ask me the larger question of how do you become this thing, you become a music critic by having opinions on music that you won't stop pressing on other people. And it's the same way you become a stand-up comedian, I think, which is that you decide you deserve to be, you suck at it, and you annoy people for quite a long time. And then eventually someone says, oh, good point, or someone laughs in the stand-up comedy thing. And you will yourself into a position of self-created authority. And basically, because all a music critic is to me is the leader of a conversation, the instigator, moderator, and leader of a conversation, and someone who has a knack for summarizing what they're thinking in a fun, interesting way. I mean, fun maybe is a word people would wince at, but I always thought the writing should feel interesting, alive, vibrant, conversational. It can be erudite and pointed too, but it has to embody something social, because the critiquing something is inherently social. You don't do it in a void. You don't critique something to yourself. You critique something to someone else to prove something about what you think and believe. So the writing has to feel that way too. And so really you're becoming an expert in like bar or cocktail conversation level discourse. I can already hear myself saying things that are annoying to people who work on this field. But this is truly how I feel about it on a gut level, right? And so what you do is you just go out there and you like, what did I do? What I did in the early 2000s is that I was on freaking message boards. It's not a glamorous come up. I was on message boards arguing about fucking whatever it was at the time, probably Max B and Clips mixtapes and Radiohead in Rainbows, and just all this nerdy stuff while I was trying not to be caught not doing the full-time job that I had at my computer at that time. And I wrote for free for 2 years, probably more, in my early 20s, and was unbelievably psyched to get to do so, right? For a website that no longer exists called Stylus, which was a really great internet magazine put together by this dude, Todd Burns. And I don't want to condescend to Stylus by saying it was where you went if you couldn't get paid to write, because he only took really good writers. I mean, he did curate the site, but a lot of those writers went on to write after Stylus was over for other, not more professional places, but places that paid and had a staff, right? And so in that sense, it was like a place where I got to have an editor. Like Alfred Soto edited for Stylus, a guy who's still out there writing now. And I found an indulgent place that would let me practice my fastball, or my routine, or my tight five version of a music review. And as you test out, it's like basically to qualify, you have to hold someone's attention for the length of a piece. And people who are reading or commenting decide whether or not this piece was interesting or total bullshit, or they don't comment at all because it was boring and not good enough for anyone to even interact with, right? And so I did that for long enough until I was able to amass enough clips to send to someone else who would pay me. And I said this once, and I still kind of believe it. The thing that differentiates an amateur music critic from a professional one is just a paycheck. And so then, like, the journalism part comes in. Journalism is his whole other job, and I kind of learned how to be a journalist because I had to interview people. And if you have a decent sense of decorum and etiquette about what may or may not be smart to do in an interview situation, a professional situation, you can kind of navigate without fucking up. But there's still hard journalism training that most quote unquote music journalists just, it's not necessarily a prerequisite.
Right.
But that whole spiel is so funny to me because that was early 2000s. Like, MP3s were still mostly the way people listened to digital music. Streaming didn't even exist yet.
Right.
MP3 blogs were still a thing that is like another universe of music and consumption. And it's as remote now as being a newspaper critic was to us in 2005. Sure. Right now, writing long form words about music is increasingly an arcane practice that is going to appeal to the same sorts of people who subscribe to literary magazines. It is not a consumer guide at all anymore. Most of these publications in their heyday, they pulled you in because you really needed someone to do this for you. Music cost money. Sometimes it cost significant amounts of money, and you could lure someone in with just the promise of helping them, and then the nerds would stay because they liked reading the words. And now only nerds who like words are left. And I think that's important and good. And that's always only ever been the true core demographic of music criticism. And I think that's gotten lost. Like, the idea that writing long form essays about albums was ever a viable career path has sort of been a shaky one. And in the heyday of magazines were supported by House of Cards. Magazines were built on the back of the music industry, which is built on the back of physical media. It's just multiple levels of this pyramid, and it only existed towards the top, right? All these other things had to exist for a monthly subscription magazine that people were like, I've got to rush out and buy this physical product, and that would bring enough money in. And it's like all that stuff is like a soap bubble. It was going to pop and disappear any minute. And I could never muster the outrage. I can muster sadness for people who lose their jobs, and I can muster sadness for, like, oh man, I missed this golden era when this was possible, but I can't muster outrage.
Right.
Because it always seems so improbable and unlikely to begin with. And so now that physical media has disappeared, along with most print media, what's left are the only people who are here because there are a room full of people who want to read about albums, and that's an audience. It's not very big, but it does exist. But I don't know. It's so funny that you started this by asking me, how did you become a music journalist? Because I increasingly feel like the answer to that question is trivia and meaningless, particularly if anyone is trying to figure out how they want to become one now.
Sure.
Because there are zero rules that I think apply.
No, I think you're right. I don't know any, I don't know many young people, period, but I don't know any young people that aspire to become music journalists anymore. It's not like 20 or 30 years ago when you saw Robert Christgau or read an issue of Vibe or Spin and see like names repeatedly come up.
Sure. Or, like
that person.
Maybe you'd want to be Touré because he was the critic who was also a guy on TV, or maybe you wanted to be Rob Sheffield or Chuck Klosterman. It used to be that. Anyway, I'm not even sure this is where you wanted to steer our conversation. I will.
It's all good. So we're going to take a hard left.
I think it's time. Yeah. Sorry.
No, it's fine. I love the tangents and the detours.
Okay, good. I'm good at those.
So I personally knew of you through Pitchfork, but also through your memoir, which covers a very, very difficult topic, which is the loss of a child. And honestly, the first question that comes to my head is, what does it feel like to be so strongly identified with something so tragic?
It's interesting. I have to sort of ask myself that question right in front of you again, to be honest, Mike, because I have to remind myself sometimes that it's true. I never thought of what happened to my daughter as being defining of who I am in the world. It's defining of who I am to myself, right? and defining of my experience in my life on Earth. People know who I am and what my name, if they know it. That is something that I have to continually be reminded of. And I think that I am always, people use the word humbled in a very insincere context a lot when they're saying, oh, I was so humbled when this incredible honor came to me. But it does seem to me like that is a bit how it feels, because what happened to Greta and what happened to our family is so much bigger than me. And what unites me to people who are reaching out is so much bigger than all of us. The tragedy that happens to you when something like this happens, when you unexpectedly lose your child, is so much bigger than everything that you just feel like you're two people who happen to be huddled under the same tent. And I know that when their people are reaching out to me to say, I read your book, that they must have sought out my name or heard about this book and gone to a store and bought it. And then I was a name on a book and they read it and it became this story that, and in it, they were maybe trying to imagine the person out in the world. And so I understand when I think about it, like, oh, this person must have a very specific relationship to the idea of me. And I can think about whenever you interact with someone else through a medium, there's something that represents you in between you and this person that they've spent time with. And yet when they reach you, you haven't been there at the moment that they encountered this thing you put out in the world. And so you're just startled by the appearance of this very real human person in your inbox or in your Instagram stories who's telling you something incredibly raw, incredibly powerful, super personal, and you forget that there was a book. I forget that there was a book out there that is like a product, and now its life in the world is of something someone can order from Amazon, and in it contains the most intimate details of my life and my struggles and sort of soul bearing through this time. Um, and so the telling of the story is so very real to me, and people coming to me to talk about what happened to them is so very real to me. But my existence in the world outside of myself, I mean, is not real to me at all. Like, I don't understand that part. And so when people come to me, there's almost this funny moment of like, wait, how do you know? How do you know about my daughter? How do you know about my life? Oh my God. Oh, you read, oh. And that's why I say humble, because it's a bit like, holy shit, I'm going about my life out there. And there's this thing out in the world, this, I don't know, this signal that's broadcasting at intervals, and I have no idea what it's doing. And so I have to imagine that's how a lot of people feel. Also, I think that there are people who I've made friends with, people who've written books about similar moments in their own lives where tragedy upended everything they thought they knew. When I went back to school, I got to know Suleika Jawad, who went on to write this very famous book, Between Two Kingdoms, which is about her struggle with leukemia in her early 20s. And she's gone on to do an incredible TED Talk about it. I mean, unfortunately, she relapsed, and so now she has a newsletter, and her newsletter, which it is still a lot of writing prompts, it is informed by this ongoing story. It doesn't define her, but it is something that she has to talk about a lot more. Whereas I wrote one book, right? And there was a moment when I was like, am I going to go and be a public speaker about my daughter's death? It seemed like something that I could do. And I quickly realized that, I mean, honestly, that's not something people are eager to find. It's just such a dark story. And so it wasn't like I was about to be confronted with the choice of, oh, you could speak here, you could speak there. But I did it once or twice. I remember realizing pretty quickly that I had told this story once for a reason, and that it was the only time I ever wanted to tell it, and that it was very much going to be the one book about this in my life. Like, some people might have chosen to write a second book, right? Continuing the story. And because I sort of put it behind, not the life experience, but I put the book behind me and started focusing on something else, it's even harder for me sometimes to be reminded of the fact that the book I do have out there is about grief, it's about death, and it's about the hardest moments of my life, because I don't live in a world where I'm constantly thinking about it. Yeah. So I'll be going about my day, and then all of a sudden, someone will tell me, hey, I just read your book. It was really powerful. I just lost my 4-year-old last Sunday, and the shock of having someone reach out to you. I mean, imagine it. It's like having someone grab your shoulder. It's not bad, and I want to say that right off the bat. It's never bad. It's powerful, and it shows you there's something really truly religious and spiritual in the power of a book and a story it contains. Like, it does things that nothing else in my life could do.
There's the whole element of people being able to relate, right? And I talk so much about community during these interviews all the time. And it feels like when people are going through something that is grief related or tragedy related, they don't want to isolate. They want to find other people who have had the same experience so they feel a lot less alone. And someone could just Google whatever and you would pop up, or someone could recommend your book to somebody and your name would pop up. And so that just sort of makes you an easy access point for people to share and channel what they're going through. You know, which feels
and
like
I
a lot of pressure.
yeah. I mean, I don't. I mean, I understand that, and I think that that's a very understandable perspective on it. Like, oh, wow. And there are moments where if you haven't answered an email from someone who has written to you and said that their adult child has just died, that is not the same as every other thing in your life that you haven't finished doing, right? That is someone's very real life pain. So in that sense, there is I don't know that obligation is the right word, but I do feel a sense of obligation. Like, this person is really putting themselves out there into empty space, and they're hoping that I'm out there to respond. And so, yes, there's a level of, I guess, pressure in that. But also, you are in the same group. You are the same kind of person. You have been through something that no one else really who hasn't been through it has the same perspective on. I don't know how to relate it to something else, but people feel pressure when they're worried they can't meet someone where they are and they feel like somebody wants something from them that they can't give, right? But like with bereaved parents, you're united already, right? I know this also from experience, right? When I could feel that people who were trying to help us when Stacy and I were going through grief, I could feel that there was pressure that they were feeling, right? How can I make these people feel better? How can I help? And I think that because I understand on a bone deep level that nothing anyone else does really matters all that much, and not in a negative way, right? But there's nothing that people can say that's wrong enough that it's going to be so bad that it somehow gets in the way of this horrible reality that you're already being surrounded by and subsumed in, right? Like, the worst thing in the world has already happened to me. Don't worry about whatever it is that you thought you said wrong, right? And so I think that having understood that on a visceral level, what mattered to me was that people showed up. Maybe they said something awkward, and I'm sure that they probably walked away repeating it to themselves and being like, wow, I wish I hadn't said that. But I knew that they were just there and trying and witnessing and showing up and all that stuff. And so I think that because I know that, I also know that the pressure is non-existent, right? They're just looking for a human connection. You know what I mean? They're not looking for me to help them solve anything. They just want to know that I'm alive. The person who wrote this story is alive and breathing on the other end of the line.
Right.
Because I think it helps prove something to them that they needed to know, right? They've read this story and now they want to know, okay, there's some hope here. This person is still alive. And then when they reach out and they hear from me, it's double confirmation. This person not only lived through this, he wrote this story. Maybe I will also live through this. And I think that that's really all that's being asked of me. And so, yeah, the pressure part, it dissolves in light of that.
As someone who has put such a vulnerable and open document of themselves out in the world, I'm curious, has that vulnerability and transparency always been like the Jayson Greene MO?
Yeah, I think probably for better and for worse. I've always been a person who has always been vulnerable and open and transparent. And throughout my teenage years, it was something I wished I could control but couldn't.
Were you a sensitive boy?
Profoundly, yes. Yes, extremely sensitive. And always sort of alert and attuned to feelings, and to a level where you didn't really know what you were reacting to. Like I remember comparing myself to a tuning fork when I was 17. I was like, I feel like I'm just vibrating to things that if I pass by someone, I don't know how to separate out what I'm thinking from what this person's feeling, and it's confusing. I think it's a thing that a lot of people deal with.
And I didn't ask as a derisive thing because I also have been, still am, and probably always will be accused of being oversensitive.
Sure. Yeah.
And given the overarching topic of this podcast, men who are considered sensitive or who have feelings are often bullied as children and as adults sometimes, just seen as, in some ways, maybe not super manly.
Yeah.
And
for sure.
I don't think my sensitivity makes me less manly. What is manly to begin with? My sensitivity is who I am. You mentioned that transparency and that vulnerability has been good for you and has been bad for you. I'm wondering in what ways has it gone in either direction?
Well, I guess I would ask you, like, you've talked to me a little bit about what it was like to grow up in the area you grew up in, as a black queer male, and feeling like you knew that you probably needed to protect yourself in ways from people who were not going to be okay with that. And so I'm sure I could ask you some of these exact same questions, right? Like, I feel like what you learn pretty early, immediately in some ways, right? I think maybe the first time I became aware of the way that I naturally existed and moved through the world and treated people as being a negative. And I was pretty sheltered and lucky in many respects in this way. I feel like I was probably not even until I was 10 or even 11 years old, where I think before then, whatever I knew about myself, I'm not as into sports as other kids. I like to sit and dream and think about things in my own head and not necessarily participate in the group. I have a really overactive imagination, and I like to pretend play more than my friends do. We're all not negative. They're all positive in some ways, right? They were just how I defined myself. And it wasn't until you get out into the world that the social structures of the larger world start to reflect themselves in your classroom or your peer group that you start to understand that there are other people out there who, or you become sensitive for the first time to the possibility that the way you are is wrong. And I feel like it wasn't until I was a little bit older that people started singling me out, and I was very confused and puzzled because no one had ever done this to me before. And I couldn't make head or tail of what this kid, this boy, or whoever it was, saw in me that I didn't know was in me, that singled me out for mockery, for abuse, for teasing, for harassing, right? And it was very much like experienced in a little kid level as like this urgent, weird mystery. Why is this kid doing this to me, Mom? What's wrong? I was very innocent of the way that masculinity asserts itself, very innocent of it. And then once that happens, that's when these negative messages enter in. Not that I'm not into sports as much as other kids. I'm really bad at sports, and that's a problem that makes me lesser. Clearly I'm bad at being a boy. And yeah, once it starts happening, it happens really quickly. It's a steamroller, right? I mean, it really happens almost overnight. And I think that by the time I was in high school, I was really horrified by the theater of cruelty that seemed to be necessary for everyone around me, or all the boys I knew who had previously been seemingly sweet-natured, kind, polite, polite to my mom, pretty generous, nice to everybody, want everyone to get along. The way that I saw them evolve and put on this ugly mask to the point where I couldn't recognize that kid anymore behind them, it happened in a matter of months, it seemed like, between 9th and 10th grade, where they entered this larger social scene of older kids who were passing down the lessons of the patriarchy to them. These were 17, 18-year-old kids passing down the lessons of the patriarchy they learned from their fathers, their uncles, their whoever's, to these 14-year-old, 15-year-old kids. And I remember looking around, and it's like there's some draft officer from hell tapping all these kids on the shoulder and telling them that this is the way that it is. And it came knocking for them all. And it's really still something that lives with me. I remember going over to my friend's house, these three boys, to sleep over and feeling like I was entering into a ring of the inferno because I knew that the next 24 hours are going to be psychological hell for me. I was the piggy in the Lord of the Flies in this social circle. They kept me around, but I was soft. I was easily bullied. They used me to get out their aggressions, right? They wanted me around, but they knew that they could kick me physically and metaphorically, I suppose, as much as they wanted. And it was this sort of abusive friendship. I mean, I'm framing it this way, but you could also just ask any like kind of bro-y dude about their friends and they would tell you the same stories that I have, but they'd tell it like, oh, they wouldn't stop fucking with me. Like they were less sensitive and it felt like it was part of this is how you talk to people. This is how you deal with people. But for me, it felt like I was being brutalized, tortured, and I was unequipped and didn't want this sort of theater of cruelty. And I remember one night we were literally watching Lord of the Flies. That was the movie that we'd gotten from Blockbuster to watch at night. And I remember watching it and feeling this bone deep chill about what I was seeing. And the thing that I never let go of is that there's the scene when Piggy, you know, the soft kid, is killed. They drop the rock on his head. And it's a horror movie, obviously. It's supposed to be this pinnacle of what happens to boys who are going to become men when they're left to their own devices. And I remember wanting to cry. And these three boys cracked up and they rewound it and played it again. And rewound it and played it again. So the rock just keeps killing Piggy. And I remember being like, I want out. This is not my society. These are not my people. This is not my world. And so by then, at that point, what you do when you're faced with this much, whatever you want to call that, you start to define yourself against, because there's no positive way to define yourself for, right? All I had in the world for examples of what boys and men were supposed to be were not only things that I didn't do naturally, they're also things in many cases that I found repellent, abhorrent, inexplicable. I mean, I feel like in the course of 1 year, I heard about or learned that almost every single girl that we grew up with, that we knew as friends, had endured some form of sexual assault. From older kids and all these boys that you knew them in elementary school, who played with them in gym class or whatever, knew about it and kind of chuckled about it, leered about it, turned their heads about it. And that's when I really felt like I was trapped inside of something kind of deadly. I remember that was how it experienced in my system at age 14. I'm like, people are not going to get out of this, and I might not get out of this okay. People are playing for very real stakes here. This has gotten too scary. And so, yeah, that was when I started identifying, without having the language for it, as much more feminine than masculine. It became my sort of curse because wherever I went, there were boys who would call me. I mean, the irony of growing up in like Western New York, which is now like bright scarlet Trump red and has been for a while, right? As a straight heterosexual boy who was called gay slurs every day for 3 years, 4 years, every day, hundreds of times by everybody. And even in some cases by people who I knew later on came out.
That is always the case.
They were partaking in this theater of cruelty because they were like, I don't want to be Piggy.
Yeah.
If it's not him, it's going to be me. Look, this is how they treat someone that they even know, right? They don't even know what the word gay or queer means practically. They just know it's a slur for those who cannot be male, those who cannot be men. And I actually am attracted to these kids. What would they do to me if any of them had an inkling that that was true? So I'm going to join in. I'm going to call this kid a queer. I'm going to do that because it is a safety mechanism.
Throwing somebody under the bus to save yourself.
Yeah, and I don't really begrudge them that. You know,
Yeah.
I mean, I was a kid who played violin. There weren't any boys who played violin where I grew up.
Violin.
Oh, you too? Yeah, okay, great.
5th and 6th grade.
I played from when I was 5 straight through to college, actually. It was a big part of my life and my identity for most of my young childhood and, yeah, through to my early 20s.
Oh, wow.
I don't play it anymore, which is a bummer. And so then you discover there are other people in the way that you always do, right? You go outside of your community and you find others. You find, oh, there's another boy who plays violin. He seems to be very similar to me. And then you start to construct your alternate identity, right? This is who I will be in the world when I escape where I am. You make plans for this person that you'll become. And you start to put together visions of who you could be. And it's very contingent. There aren't a lot of people. but you can put it together piece by piece. Maybe I can be a little bit like this guy, a little bit like that guy. Maybe this is a vision of who I could be and still technically inhabit maledom in this world, be a man of some kind. But yeah, it's always sifting through all the examples you don't want to find the one or two that just might be possible.
And it feels so much easier now to find that than it was when you were younger or when I was younger.
Yeah, I don't want to make claims about what it's like now, but I know what you mean. From my vantage point, it does seem that way. But I also have to say that I have gotten on the subway in my very bougie liberal part of New York City and ridden the F train from Carroll and heard a couple of middle school kids snicker about faggots.
Yeah. Yeah.
No one was like, hey, that's not cool to say. There was no woke kid who said that in this group of 4 boys. And I remember thinking, that doesn't surprise me. And I'm actually encountering some of this disbelief among other parents in my little liberal bubble, where they're confused that their children seem to be reenacting some of these dynamics. They're like, wait, no, we market corrected for these tendencies. Shouldn't they disappear? And I think a lot of them maybe didn't grow up in communities where there was the kind of raw, unfiltered masculine cruelty, as in the blue collar one that I grew up with.
Right.
And so I come in with such a deep cynicism that it oddly is serving me in certain respects, because I'm like, no, these things are hardwired. You can't market correct this by buying them a series of picture books when they're 2, or by using certain vocabulary or avoiding certain TV shows. It's not just like you clear your immediate viewpoint of all the things that are obviously this or obviously that, and then your kid just grows up accepting everybody. This is just not how it all works, right?
It goes back to the throwing people under the bus to save yourself kind of thing. Even if you're a kid that is aware of the fact that people are different and there are multiple ways to be a man or a boy and all of this stuff. If you want to fit in with your boys, you're going to see a kid walking down the street with nail polish on, or that might have certain mannerisms, and be like, oh, hey, faggot, you're going to do that, even if it goes against everything you feel inside, because you don't want to be the target.
So your podcast, I mean, it's about masculinity. It's about detoxicity. It's about this idea of like, I don't fit any of the roles that are readily available. Maybe who does, right? And that's the ultimate question. I'm like, if there's shades of masculinity, and masculinity is like brown or black or gray, I'm burnt orange or lime green. I'm way off the fucking spectrum, right? It's clear that I'm not going to be this, right? It's interesting because I feel like I don't know if it's a fiction that our fathers or whoever had more stable role models than we did. I feel like there's a narrative currently very popular that masculinity is in free fall, or the idea of masculinity is so unsettled. It's both a beautiful sort of place of discovery and possibility, but also a place of tabula rasa. Nobody knows what the way forward is. In some ways, I would imagine your podcast is a response to that feeling and that question. And there's this sort of popular idea that I don't think it's true, but it exists in the cultural imagination that, the idea of back when men were men, and for better and for worse, there was an era when masculinity was a more stable identity. And I think that that's also bullshit, honestly.
I agree.
And always has been. But it exerts a power on the conversation, right? Bad ideas still warp the way you feel. Right. And so it's really hard to watch old movies, which are full of really powerful messaging about what men look like, how men behave, and look at old magazines or even old pictures from your family and see what people looked like, how they stood, how they behaved, what kind of jobs they had 60 years ago, 80 years ago. Think about historical events and how men were conscripted to take part in them or not. And it's hard to look at that sometimes and not feel this reflexive, oh, well, that wasn't good, was bad, but it was clearer in many respects. But that's the thing that I think a lot of men now who are bewildered sometimes look around and feel, and I know I do, and I have to check myself and be like, no, this has always been entropy. This has always been chaos, right? People were, if anything, probably twice as terrified then, because the possibility for censure was so much greater, right? The way that you patrol a border is through violence. The borders of masculinity, the borders of a nation, the borders of anything. The way that you patrol the borders of a community and an identity is through violence. It's the only way you police it.
Yeah. We come from an era where there was a monoculture.
Yep.
And
And
there
that
was
is very seductive.
right, and there was an agenda behind that monoculture, and it was very
Yes.
much like either you fall in line or you fall the fuck out. And look, I grew up in the Rambo era, right?
Yeah, same.
And there's some value to that stuff, but also the picture is bigger now. And you look at these hard, super masculine guys, and on one hand, you think of people like Donald Trump who fuck him, but
Right.
also it's like these are the guys who develop drinking problems. These are the guys
Yep.
who beat their
Yeah.
spouses. These are
Right.
the guys who get caught sucking dick in a fucking bathroom
Yeah.
stall on an airplane. These
Yep.
are the guys who kill
Yeah.
themselves.
Absolutely. I mean, the message is the same, right? These men were drinking twice as much poison in many regards. And my wife and I talk about this all the time because my wife sometimes feels like she does not also fit the feminine very comfortably or easily. And I hope I'm not doing anything wrong by talking about her. I'll just say that. But in the context of our conversation, sometimes we'll talk about how in our own marriage, right, in our own little model household that we have built, I am the more feminine one and she's the more masculine one. And how that creates this interesting sort of swirl in our home. Both of us grew up in nuclear families with a mom and a dad. I mean, they are deviated from the norm in certain ways, but we have those things in our head. Again, I spoke about hardwiring earlier. And the crazy thing about hardwiring is that you're never not reacting to it, right? You're never not reacting to the things that you were hardwired to believe. And so we can't ever completely stop noticing the fact that I'm the more feminine one and she's the more masculine one. It will always be an object of some remarkableness in our home because of what happens to us when we leave our home, because of who we encounter. And not even what happens to us, just the air that we're breathing when we leave the home.
Right.
And I think that there's something really powerful in thinking about those sorts of things, and that in our marriage, we're very much like we're all mixed up. You know, my wife is the person who comes home after a really hard day's work. And sometimes we used to joke that she was like Don Draper. She'd come home and be like, where's my drink? My feet hurt. And I'd be like, coming. And it was kind of a family joke for a minute there for a year or two. But then the question of masculinity is like, well, how am I allowed to feel about that, right? Or how do I allow myself, right? Only I'm in control. But how do I allow myself to feel about that? What does the voice in my head tell me about that? What have I learned about this behavior that I have to unlearn? And what have I learned about this behavior that I have to continually unlearn and constantly react to this idea? I mean, it's funny that I spouted these ideas of monoculture and movies, and I'm realizing it's because I've been watching a lot of movies lately, and I'm watching Westerns and older movies, and my eyeballs have been soaking up images of stoic masculinity for like a week straight, and it's just interesting how I can feel that going directly to the back of my brain. And so even in the things you choose that you love are still in the water. And that's the thing that I feel like I've thought a lot about with masculinity, with role playing. It's the same way I feel about sexism and racism. The lead is in the drinking water, right? You can be aware that it's there, but you're still drinking it. And then what, right? How do you figure that out for yourself? What does it mean to have drank the water with lead in it and to only be allowed to have the knowledge that you have?
And people answer that question in different ways. There's so many mental gymnastics, Jedi mind tricks, whatever.
Yep.
Folks play on themselves and one another to just make sense of all of this.
Yeah, it is. Anyway, speaking of movies, I just watched a movie recently with my son that felt like the sweaty sort of underside of the current male's like in debate over the new masculinity. This movie felt like this is the manic freefall version of this person with these questions. And the movie I watched with my son, because he'd seen the poster, was If, with John Krasinski.
Okay.
And let me tell you something. You'd watch this movie and you come away with this thought alone. America's white dads are not doing well at all. It is dark. It's this weird story about a manic elder millennial dad who is a dad for the first time and just thrashing his way through some really confusing feelings about fatherhood, about what it means. It's like Patch Adams meets The Sixth Sense. It's a really fucked up, weird, disturbing film. And I remember watching it and just thinking like, this is what it looks like when someone is just starting to ask themselves some questions about what their role looks like. It happens to be a huge Hollywood star with a huge budget, and so we're treated to the inside of this man's psyche, and it's one of the most uniquely bad car wrecks I've had the misfortune of watching in quite some time. But it was one of those moments where I was watching it with my son, and I'm like, oh, the dark side of this is that I'm him, right? I'm this guy who's manically overcompensating for his lack of male role models, for his inability to embody a stable idea of what a father looks like because that vision keeps changing in his head every 2 seconds. Who feels like he needs to make up for he needs to be like Bugs Bunny on the baseball team, playing every position at once,
Mm-hmm.
like fathering the shit out of every moment, suffocating every drop of air in the room, being everything to everyone, tap dancing until he passes out, right? That's what the movie feels like. And it struck an uncomfortable chord in me because I recognize that person in myself, right? I've told myself that in order to make up for whatever it is that I feel like I'm hardwired to do, right? And this is a liberal male guilt, is like, I have to do this and this and this. And I can feel myself dancing. And then I'm like, whoa, dude, stop it. And that is a real reaction. It's a reaction, right? I mean, that's something people do. You overcompensate for perceived failures. You overcorrect for perceived weaknesses. You're fighting, and what you're doing is exactly what every generation before you has done. You're thrashing against the voices that no one around you is even hearing.
Right. One thing we might have an advantage with is that, and maybe this is just me in therapy speak, and I will also preface this by saying I do not do this as often as I would like to, is when those thoughts are racing and all of these things are happening and you're doing all the what if and the why and all of this stuff, you got to stop.
You do.
And realize you're in the moment, or realize when you can be in the moment, and all you have is the moment, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I'm telling you how it feels in my head when things are scrambled and when they're confused, in moments of high tension, high anxiety or confusion. But yeah, when it clears, right, there is a certain essential selfness to you that can communicate itself just fine without anything. And this is how you feel your way through. And everyone I've ever met in my life that has mattered to me has been someone I connected with on that level, who I can feel that energy from. And you're right. Those are the moments, but they are real. It's like a bad knee acting up. You don't sleep well. You have a couple days where you're stressed, and all of a sudden you're like, oh, my masculinity is really acting up today. It feels like, wow, that voice in my head's going fucking wild today. Yeah, I don't know.
How do you calm that? And there's two questions here. It's like, how do you calm that? Because I know you meditate and do a lot of stuff. You do yoga.
Yeah.
And also, this sounds like a Barbara Walters question. What drives Jayson Greene? What is your ethos? What do you want to be?
I really feel like I'm most myself when I'm doing the things that matter to me. There is a very profound selfness in that realization in my 10-year-old self. I want to be an author and I want to be a father. And I was on to something. I knew something about what made me happy, about who I was, about what drives me. And you feel that profound selfness when I'm with my son, just hearing about whatever's going on in his day. And when I'm writing, there are lots of moments in my life where everything else falls away and I just kind of know. I don't know how deep. I mean, I feel like we can almost do a whole second call.
I think we probably should, actually.
It feels a bit like we spent half this not quite getting to the point. Maybe we should. So I'll just say that I'm not sure I can get this deep from where we are. But one thing I would say and would want to say and talk about is about how I feel far more feminine. And I don't know. I said this to you the first time we had drinks and hung out, where it's like, this is an interesting question of who I might have been and what paths my life might have taken. Not that I wouldn't have this essential selfness to me, that I would still be a person who loves to write, still be a person who cared about his inner circle, who loved music and all the things I love. But decisions I've made and choices I've made and paths that have led me to where I am, they might have looked a little different if I'd grown up without as much of the negative reinforcement. And for all that I said earlier about hardwiring and how I do think that I see less of this sort of primal behavior happening among the children of my kids' age. You know, my about to be 8-year-old son, he is able to point to someone in his immediate circle who's older, who's transitioned, or just considers themselves non-binary and is a really close friend. And it's a normal fact of his life. It is just another member of his Sesame Street neighborhood, of his childhood circle.
Right.
And as a result of knowing someone like that in their life, it's not a talking point. It's not a lesson that his parents have had to reinforce. It's just his friend. And because his friend is a fact, the idea that someone can be fluid is a fact. in a way that it never would have been in my lifetime.
Mine either.
Ever, right? And I just know how that shapes him will change the way that he looks at life. And I do sort of see that, like, I'm not attracted to men, but I think attraction does come from a lot of selfness, but I also think that there's such a strong verboten aspect to not being attracted to men, even if you know that you are not,
Right.
that it's sort of, used the term Jedi mind trick earlier. I mean, how many Hollywood comedies are about the terror between two straight men that one of them might accidentally be attracted to the other?
That is absolutely a trope. And one thing I notice that I've had a lot of conversations about, both on podcast and off podcast over the last few months, is a lot of guys in our, well, let me start from a different place. Attraction takes many different forms. And there's physical attraction, there's
Yes, it does.
There's a vibe, there's
mental, spiritual, emotional.
Yeah, all sorts of different levels of attraction.
Right.
One thing that has come up in a lot of the conversations that I've had with guys in our age range is getting to this inflection point where some folks are thinking about gender in a more expansive way, but also, almost to a man, everybody's thinking about sexuality in a different kind of way.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I am too. And it's interesting to think about that.
We grew up with AIDS hysteria. We grew up with rampant homophobia, biphobia, queerphobia, whatever the hell you want to call it, and not knowledge that sexuality and romantic interests are separate in a spectrum. I feel like a lot of guys are hitting that 40 point or hitting that 50 point, and I'm going to make this anonymous a little bit. I remember having a conversation with a buddy of mine recently who is in his early 50s, and he was like, I was sexually assaulted as a teenager, and then grew up in this conservative environment with AIDS hysteria, and it's only now 30, 40 years later that I'm like, maybe my trauma combined with socialized behavior has kept me from exploring this part of me that I'm starting to feel is really valid.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, Mike, it is astounding to me that this conversation we're having about not fitting the mold of masculinity, about feeling more sensitive and feminine than others, I think it is such a profound marker of our generational trauma and the place we came from, that you and I have been on this call for an hour and 10 minutes, and I have not used the word queerness once in a positive context in terms of my own life, right? I told you that I was called it as a child. But what I'm talking about is queerness, right? And the idea that I have really become enraptured with a little bit and quietly sort of in love with is this notion of queerness as just a countercurrent against the current of gender roles and sexuality. And I have like 4 straight male friends, honestly, maybe 5 now since I met Adam. But when I went to college, and I was making friends with guys, I was like, oh, I really like Drew. I really like John. I really like this person. And then one by one, every one of them came out of the closet. And I remember being very proud and happy for them, and also confused because I thought that they were another version of what I thought I might be. And it wasn't a problem, but it was a bit of a, well, I'm not attracted to men. I don't want to have sex with men. But all my friends who are men who I feel most connected to all do feel that way. And so that was another sort of Gordian knot. I was like, well, do I? No, I really don't. I don't want to kiss him. So what am I then? Right. And what I've come to really value is thinking about queerness is a way of life in the world. Right. And all the communities I've been pulled towards are either bohemian or queer in some fundamental way, like underground music, and the people I've connected with, the people who I feel most close to, men or women, usually exist in some form in that realm of society, in that community. But everything I've cared about in my life has come out of a place of opposition to the hetero norm. And I think that's important to me. I don't quite feel ready to sort of claim anything for myself in that regard because I'm not sure if I should, to be honest. But I know that it means a lot to me, and that everything that's ever felt profoundly affirmative and about who I am has come from that place. I'll give you an example. So when I was 17 or 18 years old, I asked to be tested for ADHD, which, spoiler alert, 20 years later, it turns out I had. 30 years later, right? At the time, I was given this interesting personality test. I don't even know if this is still the form, but it was a series of bubbled things. You bubble in, you agreement with certain statements and
like a
stuff.
Scantron kind of thing?
Yeah, basically. I don't
Okay.
remember everything. It was like an SAT form, but agree with, don't agree with. I remember that.
I recently was tested for ADHD
And
towards
did
the
you
end
do
of
this?
last year, and I remember that. So yes, it
Oh,
still
all
happens.
right. So I was 17 and taking this test, and I'm there because I think I might have trouble focusing. And I turn my form in, and then I wait a little while, and we go back to this person's office, and he calls me in with my mom, and we sit down and talk, and he's kind of doing a preamble, and then he turns to my mother and says, "Hey, could I speak to your son alone for a second?" And she looks at me, and I look at her, and I was like
Yeah,
shrugged,
what
like
the fuck?
sure.
Yeah.
So she leaves, closes the door, and he asks me if I'm a homosexual. Those were his exact words.
Huh?
And I'm still laughing at this memory because all I can think of, Mike, at the time, all I could think of was this is like the "you'll shoot your eye out" in A Christmas Story, where everywhere he goes, someone's like, "You'll shoot your eye out," and it's like, I'm here for fucking ADHD testing, and strange man closes the door and is like, "You're gay, aren't you?" What? About. And so then he proceeds to talk to me about how I scored, again, quoting, it's insane. I quote unquote scored really high on what's considered the male female index. Right. What that is, it sounds like phrenology. Who the fuck knows what that is?
Right.
But nonetheless, Mike, that stuck with me, and not in a bad way, because it affirms something I knew about myself. I feel like more feminine than masculine is really what I should say. Because those are energies. Women and men are identities, right?
Right.
And I think it's interesting that in every fictional story, except for maybe one ever written, I just instinctively made the main character a woman, a girl, right? When I wrote my fantasy epic in 7th grade, I had just read like David Eddings, and I was obsessed with rings and stones and magic and shit. The hero was a girl named Vanessa. I remember my brother being like, "Oh, interesting that you chose a girl, Jay. Like, that's hard. You have to imagine yourself in the," and I was like, "I don't know. I just did it." And the novel I just finished writing, every character in it is a woman. Every POV is from a woman's perspective. And it wasn't something that I was trying, right? I'm not attempting a trapeze act where I'm like, watch the straight man pretend to be a woman. It was just a very natural thought where I didn't want to write from the perspective of a man because I don't feel like I identify that well with that perspective.
Sure.
And so there's something there, right? I don't know what it is. And it doesn't matter what it is, right? But that's been a profound identifying energy my whole life. And the longer I live and the more I sort of figure out how to be in the world, the more joyfully and gratefully I'm leaning into that.
I love that. Being acknowledging of time.
Yes.
We, totally should do a part 2 of this. And I feel like it should be in person.
I would love to do that.
But also, I've been creating a little bit of extra content for my patrons.
Oh, cool.
And what I've been doing is having my guests ask me a question.
Oh, brilliant. Okay. Yep. I would love that.
Ask me a question, Jayson Greene.
Also, we've talked about so much. I feel like we talked a lot about like your journey. When you were younger, did you feel physically threatened often because of who you felt you were?
When I was younger, I felt physically threatened just as a matter of course. I grew up in a somewhat physically abusive environment. And corporal punishment, that kind of thing. And one thing I realized many years later is that some of the reasoning behind that corporal punishment was, and I'm gonna sort of paraphrase this, I think that my stepdad in particular was trying to beat the gay out of me.
Yeah.
I don't think I presented as gay. I presented as artistic, and I presented as sensitive. And it's interesting, like we talk about mental gymnastics, and from the vantage point of a Black parent wanting their child to be aware of all the things that are kind of messed up in this world, you want to toughen them up. And I think that was the way that my mom and my stepdad thought would toughen me up. And there's a part of me that's like, okay, I totally get it. At the same time, that damaged the fuck out of me. It took me a long time to really reconcile myself with my sexuality. It took me a really long time to come to grips with my emotions and my sensitivity. From a peer perspective, like, I think when I was around kids my age, I presented as harder than I actually was out
Right.
of self-protection. But I felt like around family, I could kind of let my guard down a little bit.
Yeah.
And I've always been like, when I was a kid, I threw a lot of punches. And there were
Yeah.
occasions in which I threw the first punch. But I do think that a lot of that was a reaction to the interactions that I had with my family,
Right.
which I feel pretty certain that there was an element of that where they were like, okay, this kid feels...
He's gonna get yeah.
Well,
He's
also,
gonna get eaten alive if we
right,
don't do this to him first. Kind
right,
of maybe mentality.
right. I think that was some of it. I don't think that was all of it. I do think some of it was just, I don't want to say abuse for jollies, but I think some of it was just utilization without a greater good cause.
Oh.
But I do think some of it was also like, you got to prepare him for this world that he's about to be going out.
That's interesting. So do you, as a result of that, feel like you were experiencing more physical threat within your home life than you did in your peer group?
I'd say it was even.
Okay. Yeah, that's
particularly due to who I was. I mean, as you know, Brooklyn in the 80s and 90s is a much different Brooklyn than the Brooklyn of 2024.
yeah, but the Brooklyn of 2024 is unevenly distributed.
Yes, 100%.
But yes.
But it's funny, I was on a date Monday or Tuesday night, and we were in Fort Greene, and I went to Brooklyn Tech.
Right.
And we're walking past Fort Greene Park, and we're walking past all of these streets, and I'm like, man, even as a grown-ass black man in 1991, 1992, these streets were not safe. Never mind a grown-ass black man walking sort of hand-in-hand with a grown-ass white man.
Right. Yeah, it's a crazy change to see in your life, in your own neighborhoods. Crazy change.
So when I went home from school, there was the chance that I would be walking down DeKalb Avenue on my way to the train, and somebody would try to rob you. I would be getting off the 2 train at my stop and walking up Church Avenue, and somebody might rob you. And I got held up at gunpoint when I was a preteen. So the lack of safety and the threat of things happening was sort of
what it looks like, what the threat looked like, right?
It was ever present. And I think people try to like gaslight me sometimes or make light of the fact that I always have my head on a swivel.
Sure.
But I grew up needing to have my head on a swivel at all times.
Couple more questions.
Sure.
Do you walk around Brooklyn with headphones on?
Ooh. Wow, I've never thought of that. Usually, no.
Right.
I like being aware of my surroundings.
So would you be comfortable walking in Fort Greene even today with like these headphones on or something like them, blasting some music?
So here's an interesting thing. I might have the headphones over my head, but nothing would be playing.
Yeah, okay. That's an interesting distinction.
I don't want anybody to bother me, but I want to be aware of what's happening.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it's weird. Generally, the only time I'm playing music outdoors is when I'm like walking towards the train or from the train.
Yeah. And my last question is, what age were you when you started to discover how you could feel a sort of sense of safety in your own body? The first time that you remember being like, this is what it feels like to not feel a sense of ever-present threat.
Woo. I don't know if I know the answer to that question. I may have been in my 30s before that happened.
Yeah.
Like, I went to my first Pride Parade when I was 19.
Right.
I was going to bars at that point as well, but there was always a sense that somebody could jump out of the fucking woodwork and punch me in the face or harass me or whatever. So even then there was a very prominent threat of not feeling safe. I would say, and I didn't like fully come out until I was probably in my late 20s, early 30s.
Yeah.
Actually, I can answer this. It was after I left New York and moved to Boston.
Okay.
That happened when I was 31.
Right. Was it just the time of your life it clicked? Was it something about being in a new environment that helped you?
It was being in a new environment strangely around people that I universally didn't know. And just feeling like I'm a New Yorker. I got some street smarts. I can walk over these people, kind of. The threat just didn't feel like it was there. And even in racist-ass Boston, yeah, I did not feel that threat.
It's interesting because it's like you had the combination of the Nafe's sort of first time in a city and experiencing anonymity mixed with a streetwise New Yorker sense of no one can fuck with me in the same time.
Right.
That's interesting because a lot of people who I know who grew up in small towns who felt like they were targeted for being gay experienced their first moment of true release in the city because they were anonymous, right? And it was usually New York.
Right.
And you left New York where you grew up and went to a different city and had some version of that for yourself.
Yeah, and I do think it was, you're right, the combination of being somewhere where I felt like I'd accumulated enough street smarts to be totally fine where I was at. Plus, like, I was more anonymous in Boston than in New York because in New York, I knew people.
Well, that's what I'm saying. New York was your small town.
Right.
It was where you were known. You were a known quantity.
Right, and this is why I'm sort of I'm very pro coming out as whatever, just because now that everybody knows who and what I am, I don't feel as unsafe. I don't feel like I'm going to walk out of that bar or I'm going to be holding hands with somebody and like a relative is going to jump out the shadows like, hey, or a friend is going to jump because they already know this shit about me. So it's not going to be a surprise to anyone.
Yeah. Wow.
So, but yeah, it was walking around Boston and being like, oh, like, I ain't scared of these people.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Interesting that for you, it sort of needed to come from a place of I can protect myself from threats before you could sort of feel a sense of maybe there isn't a threat.
Right.
Right. I mean, this is a hard question, and maybe the answer is no. And I mean, it would be hard for this to be the answer to be yes. But like, have you ever achieved a moment in your life where you were like, there is no threat? Fleeting or otherwise?
The only time that I feel that is when I am in an environment that I am in control of. So if I have a group of people over, I'm like, this is my house. I can kick people the fuck out when I want. If somebody starts acting up, I can handle it. That is when I feel as safe as I've ever felt before.
It's interesting because inherent in that is the voice inside of you that marshals the tough guy still has to come out to negotiate with the rest of you to make that agreement possible. It's détente, right? That is a wary détente.
It's,
I mean, I'm not trying to characterize your inner state.
No.
That's just what I imagine that to feel like from your description, right? It sounds like in your system, there's a guy who comes out and is like, is anyone going to fuck with me here? And okay, no.
I almost like joke about that sometimes because when I feel really threatened or when I feel really unsafe, the Brooklyn comes out of me hard.
Right. Well, that person was developed to keep you safe.
Right.
That person was there, plays an important role. And I guess the deeper question would be, and this is like, is there a God, right? But has there ever been a moment where you felt peace where that guy didn't even have to raise his hand? And is that something to aspire to?
It's something to aspire to. I've been thinking a lot about anxiety just because I have very severe anxiety. Almost to the point where I had a conversation with my doctor yesterday and I was like, I need to go back on meds because I feel like I'm having a heart attack all the time. And there are isolated incidents when I feel at peace, when I feel safe, when I feel comfortable.
Yep.
But they're very isolated incidents. And they're, again, in situations where I feel like I have some where I feel like I'm on an even keel, on the same page as the person or the people that I'm with.
Yep, right. So not so much there is no threat, but there's no threat here.
Right. Yeah, it's very like in the moment. There is a threat. There's always a threat. Threat, but the threat's outside, and I'm fine within the confines of these literal and metaphorical walls.
Yeah. Wow. Beautiful. Wow. So, thanks for sharing all that.
I thank you for asking questions. I wasn't expecting to share that much, but I'm happy to do it. Well, so first of all, you can find Jayson on Instagram at greenejayson, Greene with an extra E, so GreeneJayson, and you can also find his book, Once More We Were Stars. You can find that on Amazon, anywhere that you purchase books. He has a new novel, just about complete. Congratulations. That'll be out next year, and maybe we'll reconvene for another conversation when that book comes out. But I really want to thank Jayson for the conversation and for being so open and so transparent, which, look, is the hope for all of my guests, right? Everybody I talk to, I aim for that transparency. But for just this level of conversation, again, it really kind of hit me in the feels as we were talking. And I hope that you think that this is as special a conversation as I thought it was when I was having it. So thank you, Jayson. I appreciate you, and I look very forward to many more conversations to come. Thank you for listening to Detoxicity. I hope you found this particular episode interesting. And if you are new, I hope you go back and listen to all of the older episodes. Once again, my name is Mike Joseph. I am the host and producer of this show. And there are a lot of things that you can do to continue to support our mission, continue to support this podcast. Follow me on social media. I am on Instagram, Twitter, and I'm on TikTok as DetoxPod Guy. You can also send me an email if you'd like. I'm at detoxpod@gmail.com. I am always on the hunt for people with interesting, inspirational, and powerful stories. So if you know somebody who fits that bill, or if you yourself fit that bill, please don't hesitate to drop me a line via email or via social media. Please make sure you subscribe on your podcast platform that you're listening to this on. Rate, comment, help a brother out, help us move up in the rankings. Follow me on social media. Like I said, follow our Patreon, or subscribe to my Patreon, actually. Patreon.com/detoxicitypod. You get access to exclusive episodes. You get episodes a little earlier than the general public. You get a cool-ass sticker, lots of stuff. Once again, patreon.com/detoxicitypod. Quick shout out to Calvin Williams for providing the music and doing his magic on the logo, which was originally designed by Jacob Block. I thank you all for listening. I wish you all the best. Please take care of each other. Until next time, peace.